There, there is a kind of gratitude that's complicated. Uh, it's a gratitude that you may not even recognize as gratitude or even express as gratitude. It's not warm. It's not easy. And it's not the kind of thing that you recognize that will tie up everything neatly and let you move on with your life without looking back at it. I mean, the kind that shows up later, sometimes years later, when you realize that a person or a moment or an experience that you never asked for shifted the entire direction of your life. And it's not because the intention was to help you. And it's not because what happened was okay. It's because something that was in you, you finally saw what it was that you experienced. And that can be so uncomfortable to admit out loud because somewhere along the way we were just taught that if you find something valuable in pain, you're excusing it. You know, you're letting someone off the hook. You're saying it's fine. But that's not what I'm saying at all. And I want to be clear about that. You don't have to approve of what happened to acknowledge what it revealed within you. You don't have to thank the betrayal to recognize the clarity that came after it. Those are not the same thing. Because sometimes the most honest thing we can say is, I would never choose that again. And even in that, it still showed me something that I could not unsee. Because there are moments, and I think you know the ones that I mean, where someone crosses a line you didn't even realize that you were standing on. You know, where something breaks or shifts or exposes a truth that you've been avoiding. And it doesn't feel like growth when it's happening. It feels like confusion. It feels like hurt and disbelief. You know, that particular kind of pain that comes from abandonment, from realizing someone you trusted could just leave you right there. Or walk away from what you thought you both understood. And it feels like a disruption because it is. But here's kind of what I've come to understand. That growth rarely announces itself politely. More often it arrives disguised as the moment where the old way of living becomes impossible to continue. It comes in and throws all your ish on the floor. You know, to a point where you can't even pretend any longer that what's happening is okay. Where you can no longer manage your way around what you actually feel. Or something in you finally stops cooperating with the version of your life that was never fully right. Maybe it showed you how much of yourself that you've been pulling back on, been shrinking, how much you've been tolerating what never actually felt right, and how often you were managing someone else's comfort instead of honoring your own reality. And at the time, you may have called it clarity. You might have called it loss or conflict or heartbreak. But later, with enough distance, you realize something important. That moment didn't make you stronger. It made you honest. And honesty is what strength eventually grows from. Because once you see something clearly, you can't go back to pretending you don't. Once you recognize where a boundary actually lives, you can't unknow it. Once you feel the real cost of abandoning yourself, you can't fully convince yourself it's harmless anymore. And that's the part that matters. Not the person, not the event, not even the hurt, but the moment your internal compass finally adjusted. Now, this isn't about forced forgiveness. I'm not asking you to rewrite what happened, to make it into something softer than what it was, to make it somehow more palatable. And that's simply because some folks we are never going to feel warm toward. And that's okay. That is undoubtedly allowed. What I'm talking about is something different. Recognition. The recognition that sometimes the turning point in our lives, it just doesn't arrive through gentle encouragement or soft little landings. Sometimes those recognitions, they arrive through friction and turmoil, through contrast and betrayal, through the unmistakable feeling of something here has got to change. And once that lands, movement becomes possible. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic kind of way. Just honestly. Maybe you start speaking a little more directly. Maybe you stopped over-explaining. Over-explaining to people who weren't really listening to you anyway. Maybe you started noticing your own needs before automatically just dismissing them. Maybe you begin to choose places and spaces that don't require you to disappear just to keep the peace. Small shifts, but real ones. And over time, those small shifts reshape an entire life. So when I talk about being grateful for the catalyst, I'm not talking about the gratitude for the damage. I'm talking about recognition. The recognition of the moment you finally saw yourself clear enough to stop abandoning your own direction. Because you do not owe credit to anyone for what they didn't intend to give you. But you can acknowledge the version of you that woke up that day. The one that said, probably reluctantly, something about this is not right. And I'm allowed to listen to that. Sometimes growth doesn't come from being supported. Sometimes it comes from realizing you have to support yourself now. And that realization, once it arrives, it doesn't leave. So if there's a moment in your past that still feels complicated, a moment that you wouldn't celebrate, wouldn't repeat, wouldn't wish on anyone, and yet you know it marked the beginning of something, the beginning of seeing your life differently, of seeing yourself differently, you don't have to wrap it up in forgiveness. You don't have to call it beautiful. You can simply recognize that that was the point where I stopped being someone who could ignore herself. And sometimes that recognition alone is enough to build from. Sit with yourself there and continue traveling.